carry on. Yeah.
Well,
Welcome.
thank you very much. I'm just going to say a few brief words. Stanis and I are going to save our thank yous to the end. I think best protocol. I'm going to say just a few words about the book and how we got into this and what motivated us. And then the evening's going to take form of a dialogue, a kind of question answer back and forth. We've chosen just to run images ambiently. This one, for example, is the San Diego Tijuana terminal. This is Niagara Falls, New York. We're not going to give a slide talk. I think it's more interesting to talk a little bit about the values and ideas behind the book. And then we can certainly answer questions about any of the buildings later. Okay, why am I doing this? Why are we here tonight? Well, I've got a very strange architectural career. Most of it's dedicated towards doing books and exhibitions on Western Canadian architects. It's kind of my niche that I've developed. The reason for this is that I really believe that we have wonderful, fantastic designers in this part of the world, and our engineering, our urban development, and our construction knowledge is equal of anywhere in the world, but people don't know about it. So that's why books, that's why exhibitions. So it's indeed been a pleasure to work with Stantec and with Stanis in particular. Just to back up the clock, this all starts in 1996 when I first met Stanis and his then partner in Architectura, Clive Grout. It was around the time of the opening of YVR's International Terminal. And I was reviewing it for the Globe and Mail. And I produced whatever,
you said some very nice things.
1,100 words.
Yeah.
Yeah. Only got a few things wrong, as I heard about later. But I did that. And then, it's funny, a year or two later, Stanis said, well, sometime we should have you do something in more depth.
I said that?
Yeah. And then 24 years later, it happened. More recently, Noel Best, who is a key collaborator in the book project and a senior architect at Stantec, and I served on the board of the Contemporary Art Gallery, and we talked a few times. He kept me up to date with the designs. I got very interested in the Iqaluit design and so on. And he said, well, let's talk. Let's sit down with Stanis and talk about maybe doing a book. And it took a couple of years of negotiation and some tests, etc. And I have to give it, this is not, Stantec comes from the Stanley Engineering Company in my native Edmonton. I went there as a high school student with my portfolio of drafting drawings to get a job as an engineering draftsman when I was 18. I didn't get it. Maybe, thank God for that. But they were in a beautiful building by Peter Hemingway, so it was an engineering culture different than others, and they sanctioned and built a beautiful building. And I think this is a side of the practice that's evolved all the way through. So enough of me. I think let's start talking, Stanis, if you don't mind. Let's talk a little bit, since the airport portfolio is front and center tonight, let's talk a little bit about the very particular conditions that came together to make YVR. I think I didn't realize till we started interviews how fast and how intense the process is. Tell us something about it and how you got involved.
Well, thanks, Trevor, and thanks everybody for coming out. We began our work in 1993, so 25 years ago. So part of the impetus behind this book was to celebrate 25 years of our work in airports, and we were selected for that project for some interesting reasons. Those of you who have been around long enough will remember that the Vancouver airport was one of the very first in Canada to be privatized and then to create the opportunity for a new terminal, and very, I would say, entrepreneurial board, and I think very kind of prescient about some of the things that are key themes in airport design today, and I'll come back to that in a little while. And what they did, and you saw one of the images that went by, was the Haida Gwaii. For a newly constituted airport authority to go out and spend several $1 million on a sculpture, I think people in Vancouver wondered what they'd been smoking. And
But they bought it
before marijuana.
Exactly, but they bought it before any architectural plans were in place.
They bought it before there was any plans in place, and if you recall, they also put an airport fee in place, which was a source of great irritation to all of us who were traveling. So they didn't start off on a very good foot, but in fact, I think it was a brilliant move to buy the Haida Gwaii sculpture. Firstly, it's one of the great works of art of the last 50 years, but I think it also set the stage for creating an airport that really was going to be something uniquely differentiated and something that was going to be special about this particular city and community. And one of the reasons that we were selected was because we showed a great interest in how we could use this glorious sculpture as the kind of spring point for all of the architectural and interior design in the terminal. So when you go through it today, I believe it's one of the largest, if not the largest, collection of art of the Pacific Northwest anywhere in the world. The colors and materials that you see inside the building have been selected because they reflect the colors of the British Columbian landscape and the wood and the stone. And this whole idea of creating an airport that really could not be anywhere else other than Vancouver really set the airport apart. And I think if you look at the projects in the book, they're all very diverse, and they range from Iqaluit in the north to Santiago, Chile, and everywhere in between. But there are two common threads that link them, and the first is what we like to call in our firm a sense of place. And that really is about the fact that when you've landed in one of our airports, we want you to feel that you're in somewhere special, and we do that by making connections to whatever's special about that city and community. So that really is a theme that runs through all of our projects, and I'd be happy to talk about that in more detail if you have specific questions, Trevor. The second is, and this is an interesting one, is one of the things that designers are having to help their clients with more and more these days is what's called social license. And we're seeing that here in British Columbia with the Trans Mountain Pipeline. We see it with many large infrastructure projects, is that more and more it's important for whether it's large institutions like the airport or governments to get the local community on side. And if they don't do that, then they have a lot of trouble on their hands. And to those of you who followed it, just a week or two ago, there was a referendum in Mexico which stopped the airport project. That airport project is under construction. They've spent over $1 billion, and that project is now basically has been put on ice. And it's all about social license and creating if you like, the permission for an institution to go ahead with a major infrastructure project. And I think that's one of the things where YVR has really set a standard for making the community part of the building, for incorporating the art that's local, for if you're making references to the city and the community, and I think they deserve to be congratulated. One of the little known facts about YVR Vancouver is that every year there's a survey done in British Columbia for the best loved brands. Vancouver Airport this year was named the #3 best loved brand in British Columbia. Now, who would think of an airport being a best loved brand? By the way, they were ahead of Purdy's Chocolates, which was #7 or something.
But Lululemon was first. Yeah.
No, they weren't. No. So
it's my favorite.
So kudos to YVR and to their sort of way of looking at architecture in the context of what it means to a city and community.
Now, Stanis, there's a lot of architects and interior designers in the room here tonight. Let's talk a little bit about the design process for YVR, because it was quite an intense experience. There was really a tight time regimen, and basically the idea of a skunk works. In other words, an on-site design office which allowed a dialogue between client, engineers, and architects. Want to talk a little bit about the design process?
Well, it was extremely intense. We were hired in January of 1993, and we moved our office. We moved a group to Vancouver Airport. We were in trailers right next to the terminal. We got a good dose of jet fuel every few minutes. But it was a really intense, it was a really special experience, and we were there with the client, with the project manager, with some of the key engineers, and we worked out of there for 11 months. From the day we were hired to the day construction started on site was 11 months, and the building opened 2 years and 3 months later, which is quite unprecedented for a project of that scale and complexity. So it was literally 3 months and 2 years from the day that we started work to the day that the ribbon was cut.
And would you say that created a landscape for innovation? In other words, innovations were possible with that kind of construct that might not have been possible elsewhere?
I think it focused everybody on getting the job done. And yes, and I think the proof is in the project has stood the test of time in terms of the quality that it's set, the level that it's set. I think for the most part, people really like the airport. They like returning to the airport. I hear that comment all the time. And so I think a lot of the things we did around sort of sense of place came out of a very intense sort of workshop, if you like, skunk works kind of environment. And we didn't have the opportunity. We had to take decisions and live with them. And so often, when you're given the luxury of time, you end up sort of reinventing the wheel and going around in spirals. And we didn't have that luxury, which I think was actually beneficial to the project.
Well, I think so too, because it's really unlike any other airport. Everybody who arrives says that. Let's talk about a detail that we discuss in the book. Of course, everyone asks about the steel trees. Why aren't the steel trees made of wood? Do you want to say?
Well, I wish they had been. We looked into making them of wood. The slide just changed. We looked into making the steel trees out of wood, but at that stage, the technology just wasn't available to make the wood, the composite wood, in the quantities that was necessary for. This building's over 1 million square feet, so a really large project. I think it was a real missed opportunity, but these days one could do that, and I think should certainly consider the use of wood for all sorts of reasons, not least of which being sustainability, West Coast, all that good stuff. But yes, the basic idea was to kind of create this, if you like, to evoke the forest.
Yeah. Now, it's one thing in those particular circumstances to pull this off, but I think the real test of design strength, et cetera, is the ability then to learn from that airport and to apply some, but not all of its lessons elsewhere. Do you want to talk a little bit about the transition from YVR to my hometown, the Edmonton Airport? I just have to give you a little commercial. Go Google Architectural Digest and Stantec. They reviewed our book or wrote a story about it earlier this year, and they listed Edmonton, not YVR, as their favorite airport in the world.
Okay, well,
who knew?
Who knew?
And of course, the Edmontonians were over the moon for this, including the corporate suite of Stantec. But let's talk a little bit about that.
Great photo, because that's Edmonton, and that's the living wall actually. So yeah. So with Edmonton, we took ideas of sense of place to the next level, and that was to create a sense of place in the Edmonton Airport that was reflective of the prairies landscape. So we called it our prairies paint box. If you go there, you'll see the tones are very much inspired by the prairies. We took advantage of fabulous sort of sunsets that you get in terms of our orientation of the window of the airport and the glazing. But we also took the opportunity in more recent expansion. We've done 2 major projects at Edmonton. The first one was opened about 17 years ago, and the most recent was about 5. In the latest one, which by the way was the very first LEED Gold airport terminal in Canada and one of the very few in the world, to again address issues of concern to that community. I mean, it's no secret that Edmonton and Alberta are coming under a lot of criticism for the oil industry, for greenhouse gas emissions, etc. And so the airport wanted this project to, in a way, respond to that. So what we did was we built this living wall, giant living wall, the largest in any airport anywhere in the world, into the terminal. That creates this extraordinarily wonderful landscape sort of experience that you have both as an arriving and a departing passenger. It's the backdrop for performance artists who are musicians. contributed to the LEED Gold certification. And I think, again, just was one of those things that, that achieved the social license again, which I think is so important for a large infrastructure project.
Now, the reason why Edmonton is so interesting is that the art program there was quite different. There were some First Nations, but it was also contemporary artists, Michael Hayden and others. So it wasn't the notion that, of course, what's unique only about YVR is the art program. It is, but it works with the architecture, and the two are in dialogue. Mm-hmm. In Edmonton, it was a very interesting situation where much of the terminal is single-loaded. In other words, airplanes are on one side, and you're looking out to the western light. And the integration of natural light into the terminal is one of its great graces. Now, and so in other words, these things are not just a simple, you took the prototype of YVR and applied it. It was very much taking the principles that did transfer, but then innovating elsewhere. Is that
Absolutely.
fair to say?
Yeah, and it was very context specific. I mean, the solution that we came up, and without going into too many of the technical details, was a real innovation that we introduced. One of the big challenges with Canadian airports are amongst the most complicated in the world, because you have three types of passenger. You have domestic passengers who are flying within Canada. You have international passengers who are flying outside of North America. And then you have a strange category called transborder. And these are passengers who are flying to the US. And the reason they're in a separate category, those of you who've flown to the US will know that you clear US customs and immigration here in Canada. You don't clear it on the other side. But what that means is that once you've gone through that process in a Canadian airport, you are technically in the United States, and you have to be kept separate from all other passengers. So in fact, if you look at Canadian airports, there's 6 different passenger streams that all have to be kept varying degrees of separation. And the Edmonton solution, which you see here in section, was our way of creating separations in a way that achieved all the necessary separations, but made it very simple and intuitive for passengers. And one of the things that's challenging about airport projects is that they're quite complicated buildings, as you can imagine, and if you're not careful, a lot of the systems tend to take over the design and dominate the design. And people forget that most people don't travel very often. The average person flies maybe once every 6 months or once a year. It's very stressful, and you're kind of, it's a big building, you're not familiar with it. And one of the things that is so important for us to do as designers and planners is to make it, we call it intuitive wayfinding. Basically keep it really simple. Minimize the number of turns that passengers have to go through. Try and keep the lines of sight as clear as possible. And it's so important to kind of focus on that and not let all the technical stuff get in the way of that, so that at the end of the day, the project is a pleasant experience for passengers. And with Edmonton, we used an arrangement that had never been used before in North America to achieve that, and we've now used it on a number of subsequent projects, most recently our major project we're working on at JFK in New York.
Now, then past Edmonton, I know for a fact there's people here tonight from Winnipeg, Ottawa, Toronto. Carrying on, what's the accrual of knowledge? What are the kind of onward principles that took you into those cases, additions to existing airport terminals or replacements? What are the ongoing, what's the design ethos that took you through those?
Well, I think the fundamental principles are around intuitive wayfinding, around sense of place, are ones that we have consistently used in all of our projects. But after that, it all becomes very specific to the particular circumstances of an airport, what size it is, what kind of passengers it's serving, and different airports serve very different markets. So Vancouver Airport was a fully international terminal. Ottawa is mostly commuters. Mostly these are day passengers. And so that terminal has been designed very specifically around making it as easy as possible for somebody to get through the terminal in one shot without any vertical movement. You're doing that day trip from Ottawa to Montreal or Toronto, or somewhere fairly nearby. And so that airport really that design wouldn't make any sense anywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
So making it specific to the circumstances of the...
Now let's talk about some of the more unusual or eccentric or one-off of the terminals. Let's start with Iqaluit, which in one of my favorites, Noel Best, who's here tonight, was
Noel's around, so
very much involved with it. But let's talk about that was a triple P, okay? Public-private partnership, triple P. Which a lot of architects describe as the enemy of good design and enemy of innovation. How did you pull off some innovation there? And it's a very popular building with the local residents. My family's up there, et cetera. It's really hit a note. Within the regimen of that way of delivering a project, how was it possible?
Well, P3's private-public partnerships, there's a source of lot of debate about the merits and demerits, and the reasons that governments are looking at P3s these days in order to offload risk, and so they're not driven necessarily by design-related considerations. But I don't believe that a process is inherently good or inherently bad. I think you can get good results out of a P3 process. I think you can get bad results out of a P3 process. It depends on how well it's run, what the terms of reference are, so forth. In the case of Iqaluit, this was a really interesting project. For those of you, for the few in the audience who've been to Iqaluit, and I think there are a few, well, certainly Noel. Iqaluit's just 2 degrees south of the Arctic Circle. It's very, very harsh landscape, uncompromising. The airport is absolutely the lifeline. There are no roads to Iqaluit. So it's the heart of the city and community. And when for those again unfamiliar with the P3 world, what happens is that a government will use a firm to come up with what's called a referential design, and then various private sector teams will compete for the work, and typically will submit a design that may or may not conform to the referential design. The referential design that had been produced for Iqaluit was a very traditional 2-level terminal, arrivals at the bottom, departures up above. Nothing wrong with that in principle, except if you're in Iqaluit, that means that all passengers have to travel up the elevators, escalators, stairs, and then go back down again at some stage, whether they're arriving, departing. Now, Iqaluit, if an elevator or escalator breaks down, you can't just get a part from somewhere on the corner. You have to fly that part in, or probably the technician in as well. So that was point 1. Point 2 was that people really don't like going up and going down. My point earlier about intuitive wayfinding holds true for vertical circulation as well. And with the aging demographic, it's more, people's mobility challenges. It's really important for us as designers to find ways to avoid vertical movement. So the long and the short of it is that we came up with a really unique design. Instead of being a 2-level terminal, it was a single-level terminal. Got rid of all the elevators, escalators, and stairs. Still provided the passengers with the same level of comfort getting to and from the aircraft, with some innovations that are kind of technical, and I won't go into detail on that. But in so doing, what we were able to do is enhance the passenger experience, but we were also able to make the building not smaller in terms of its footprint, but more compact in terms of its volume. And when you do that, especially in a harsh environment like Iqaluit, you reduce the heating, the energy costs. So our project was not only better from the passenger experience, but it was also better for the private sector, for our private sector client, in terms of their financial offering. Yep. So everybody won from that project. And again, I think we brought that same sensitivity to creating a unique sense of place. The building is, I think, stunning in the landscape, a very distinctive, a roof form that really responds to the landscape, to the climate, a town center in the middle of the airport that has wonderful space for the displays of Inuit art. So again, I think a success story all around, out of a P3 process.
Sure. At the other end of the rainbow is the airport terminal that's not an airport terminal at San Diego and Tijuana. A very unique set of circumstances, and maybe tell people why Stantec and how you designed a terminal that's not a terminal. And one that, by the way, took a presidential decree from Obama.
That's right.
For permission. So tell us a
Well,
little
it's
about
certainly our strangest project, and the details in the book. It's quite difficult. Every time I describe this, I end up having to take out a piece of paper and kind of draw lines. So I'll sort of ask you all to draw a sort of imaginary line between Mexico and the United States. And for those who are familiar with San Diego region, the Tijuana airport, which is a major airport in Mexico, is just south of the border between Mexico and the United States. It's so close to the border that you can stand on the US side of the border and you can actually see the terminal. And a lot of people drive, or I'll put that in the past tense, used to drive from San Diego as far afield as Los Angeles. They would drive across the border to take cheap flights out of Tijuana, just as people these days drive across the border to Bellingham or to Seattle to take cheaper flights. So our client, a developer client, saw the opportunity to buy a piece of land on the US side of the border that was directly opposite the Tijuana terminal. And I got the strangest phone call of my career. Basically somebody I'd never met saying, we've heard about you, we understand that you have this expertise with the US Customs and Border Protection through our Canadian work, by the way. And we want to build a terminal in the United States and a bridge across the border. And who might, this is a crank call. And anyway, it turned out to be a very well-known Chicago developer, Sam Zell, and a consortium consisting of his company and a group of investors in Mexico. And literally, we built this terminal. Right now, you can go there. So instead of driving across the border, you go onto our site, you walk into our terminal, you walk across a bridge over the border, the only privately built bridge over an international border ever built anywhere in the world, and you drop straight into the Tijuana terminal. So instead of driving there, you walk across. Coming home, if you fly into Tijuana, you land, get off the plane, go over our bridge, drop into our terminal, go through U.S. Customs and Immigration, and you've arrived in the United States. Brilliant idea, really visionary idea, and of course they charge a fee for this, but the convenience is incredible, and it's a truly amazing building. Will never be repeated again. It took a presidential permit. I, Barack Obama, do hereby. And yeah, it was really one of a kind.
No, it's terrific. And by the way, the associate architect was Legoreto, one of Mexico's finance firms, et cetera. And all along, Stantec has collaborated with other firms and done very well on both sides.
Absolutely. Edmonton was a collaboration.
Yeah.
Winnipeg was a collaboration. Tijuana.
Yeah. Now, just before
Santiago.
we open it up here with some questions or comments, Stanis, we ended the book with your speculations a little bit on the future of airport design. And you're currently involved in designs for Quito, Ecuador, LaGuardia, Kennedy, many others. What can you tell us a little bit? What are the glimpses of the future of airport terminals? You've told us the principles that have driven you so far. What's changing and what's coming next?
Well, I think what's coming next is that there's a huge wave of people around the world who for the very first time can afford to fly.
Oh, okay.
And that wave is really gathering momentum, particularly from Asia, but from other parts of the world as well. Latin America, I was just in Miami speaking at a conference, a Latin American conference. There's a huge increase in traffic there, India. So air travel is certainly going to be on the increase worldwide, and a lot of people who previously have not experienced air travel are going to experience it for the first time. So I think airports need to respond to that. They certainly need to respond to the aging demographic and to the needs of people with various kinds of either mobility or cognitive disabilities. And that's I think a really important trend going forward. I'm the chair of the advisory committee to the Rick Hansen Foundation. We're looking at a new standard, accessibility standard, which is going to be rolled out here at YVR and at some other airports to basically make airports more accessible for a greater number of people. So that is certainly an emerging trend. The other big emerging trend is technology. We've all, or I assume, or many of us have used self-service technology to take your, get your boarding pass at home, increasingly to drop your bag tags off. Some of this gets a little creepy, but the one that's really going to transform air travel is biometrics, facial recognition. It's being used, whether you know it or not, in a number of airports with extraordinary accuracy. And what airports are now doing, and Amsterdam Schiphol Airport's one of the pioneers, is that as you walk in the door, they're capturing, through facial recognition, they're capturing your identity, combining it with your passport and with your ticket, and that they combine that into what's called a token, and then that token follows you around so that you don't have to pull out these documents every 5 or 10 minutes. And setting aside all the sort of security, and privacy kind of concerns, which I'm sure, that chapter has yet to be written. All of these, I think, are going to combine to make air travel a much more seamless process, a much more intuitive process, and to give people, the opportunity to enjoy it more. Air travel is a stressful experience. I mean, I fly practically every week, and I find it stressful, so I'm sure people doing it only once a year find it even more so. And I think to the extent that we can kind of calm it down, take away the barriers, or at least make them invisible, make all those processes invisible, I think we'll be enhancing the travel experience, and I certainly think that technology has the promise of that. There's a lot of talk about air travel becoming more sustainable. Airlines are experimenting, and the aircraft manufacturers are experimenting with bioengineered fuels. I think that the future of truly sort of solar air flight is a long, long way away. But I think they're also rising to the challenge of what living in a sort of sustainably sensitive world means. So for me, those are some of the trends, and you'll find find out in the book.
Yep. Well, thank you, Stanis. I think it's time we recognize the identity of our audience here. If any of you've got one of the world's great experts on airports here, and everyone who goes through what has questions, anybody with a question or comment, we'd welcome them. I don't know if we need a mic, maybe not. We're a small group, but anybody out there? Yeah.
You've all flown through airports. I'm sure you've got an opinion.
Right here? Okay.
This is specific to the Calumet Airport. There's strange pieces of vertical engineering on the entrance side. Could you explain what's happening there?
Yeah, I'm going to hand that question over to Noel. Where's Noel? There he is.
Do you want to give Noel the mic? He's asking about the siphons.
The thermosiphons.
Thermosiphons. Noel Best was the lead designer on the Calumet.
Right. The bedrock was very deep where we had to locate the airport, and therefore it's actually resting on thermosiphons. It's resting on the permafrost. And the danger, of course, is that the heat emanating from the building downward will melt the permafrost, and the building will just subside into the mud. So the solution to that, a lot of smaller buildings do one of two things there. They put them up on stilts so the wind can blow underneath and the heat dissipates. The other solution is the one we use, which is thermosiphons, which is basically putting a system not unlike a hockey rink, an artificial hockey rink, where there's a series of pipes underneath the building, which has CO2 gas in it. And the heat that comes down actually is captured by those pipes, and it's transformed into gas and goes to the vertical elements around the perimeter, where it cools and goes back down. So it's a passive loop, not unlike a refrigerator, that keeps the ground cold, so it keeps the ground frozen so the building doesn't sink down.
Yeah. One more? Here.
Well, over the years of travel in airports, I've seen that they've become more and more big shopping malls. Is that something you see continuing as a trend in airports?
Well, that's a great question, because airports really have only two sources of revenue. The one source of revenue is the airlines. The other source of revenue is you and me. And they they have to be competitive when it comes to the airlines in terms of landing fees and their charges. So what they have realized that they can do is they can enhance what are called non-aeronautical revenues, which are the revenues that come from retail, food and beverage, parking, and essentially, you and me. And a lot of airports have taken that to an extreme. Heathrow's probably, the British airports are probably the most obvious example. I think that there's a balance to be struck. I think passengers look for, once they've got over the stunning architecture, they're looking for some food and good choice in terms of food and beverage. They have discretionary time, and it's a very affluent group who can afford to travel. So they have the luxury of time. They're interested in shopping as long as the quality's good and the prices are comparable to street retail. And so we've seen a trend over the last 15 to 20 years of airport retail going from being a really cursory offering to being one that is consistent with what you would find on a high street in a typical city. Personally, I think like anything, it can be overdone. And I think some airports do go take things to an extreme where the airport becomes a shopping center with airplanes attached. But there is I think there's a reasonable balance, and it works both for the customer and for the airport, which at the end of the day it's a business.
I think we have time for one more question at the back there. Yeah.
Some of your favorites and least favorite airports in the world?
Most favorite? Well, I'm often asked, and YVR, of course.
Non-Stantec. Non-Stantec.
I would say that the one that's always comes up, if you're in the airport world, is Changi, Singapore, and Changi is really a special experience. If you've ever been there, if you have any reason to go to that part of the world, and if you're into airports, I really suggest that you take the opportunity to spend some time there, because they've done the most extraordinary job of creating a memorable sense of place. There are orchids everywhere. There's a butterfly garden that you can go into. There's a koi pond. It's absolutely stunning. The artworks and sculpture have been beautifully curated, and the level of finishes is extraordinary. So there's a reason why Changi always comes out the number one in worldwide surveys of airports around the world. So I would certainly put that on the list. In terms of least favorite, there's lots of those examples. We've helped fix some of them.
Yeah. Now, Stanis, isn't it amazing that the reasons people cite for Changi, and I would put it on my list too, but it's not capital A architecture. It's not, so many airports are these heroic structures with exposed, trusses, etc. It's none of that really. It's right. At a finer grain.
It's putting the money where it really matters to the passenger, and to the look and feel, the things that you can touch and see. And yes, you're right. They have not spent the money on architectural heroics, and there are many airports which are examples that have, which in my view may be very beautiful from an architectural point of view, but they're soulless. Yeah. And to me, that represents a failure of vision. Yeah.
Well, when we're done tonight, I'm going to ask him for directions. I'm lecturing in Lagos, Nigeria at the end of the month, so I want advice on how to negotiate that airport. I think we'll wrap it up at this point. I'm going to give the last word to Stanis, but I just want to say that I've done 9 or 10 books now, and this was the most complex project I've ever undertaken. It was complex visually, coordinating the visuals, and we have to take our hat off to our wonderful book designer, Pablo Mandel.
Absolutely, yeah. He's not here tonight.
Not here tonight, and based in Buenos Aires and here, but he did a superb job of simplifying and clarifying. And in language or in design, those are very important values. So I think we really benefited from him. There's also some people in the audience here tonight, Zulema, Aaron, and others, who helped us or did the drawings. And the issue of the drawings was very interesting, because it kind of put Stanis and I back for a moment, because we had to come up with graphic conventions for hugely complex, large buildings that also worked if you zoomed in on a piece of them. So it became a very interesting architectural problem. is how do you draw an airport, and to draw them consistently so you could compare Edmonton to Winnipeg to Vancouver. And I think that was a really bracing issue. Over and above it, this book would never happen if it had not been for Noel and Stannis standing behind it. It was a long, complex project, and there's nothing like it. It's really the first major book on Canadian airport design ever done, and I think good on Stantec and good on Stannis for doing it. So last word for you, Stannis.
Well, thanks, Trevor. Trevor didn't say why it was so challenging. It was because of a very difficult client,
Yeah. But a good one, yeah.
And we certainly had our moments during the course of the project. But kudos to you, thank you, Trevor, for having initiated the idea in the first place and having stuck with it. I think the results speak for themselves. We're very proud of the book, and I'm certainly proud of all of the efforts. There are a number of Stantec people in the room tonight, many of whom who've worked on these projects and are working on our current airports. And we went to a lot of trouble in the book to credit everybody who's worked on any of the projects because this really is a team effort, and I appreciate being here as the representative, but I really am the representative of an incredibly talented and successful team. So first thank you is to all of the Stantec staff who have participated and are participating in our airport projects right now. Certainly a big thank you to Inform for hosting this event. And I think your Informs always sort of set the bar for design in Vancouver. You can see why there are lots of stocking stuffers around, by the way, anybody is. And really thank you to Inform. Pablo, Figure One, the publishers. There's, I think, a representative or a couple of representatives of the publishers. Beautiful job on the book. And thank you all for coming out tonight.
Good.
Wonderful.
A hand for everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trevor. Thank you, Stannis. And thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight.